All right, now let's begin. You can start by creating a new document. You could just go to File, New, select a high-res document. Just make sure it's at 300 dpi and RGB, and hit OK. And now let's start with our first step. Make sure all your windows are open, like your layers, brush presets, and color. You can go and click on the window menu and open these up. Next, in your brush window, select, a default brush from Photoshop, just a regular round one. You can adjust the shape dynamics, spacing, angle, flatten it, depending on exactly how you like to personally draw. Also, don't forget to lower the opacity and flow. I usually like to do that at like around 50% on either one of them. And now selecting a black color, I'm just going to test out my brush line. And we're going to begin with the first step in our process. If you like, in your brush, you can also have your dual brush selected just to add a little extra texture. And now what we're going to do is we're going to just start drawing out some fantasy trees. Now, as I mentioned in the first video, this tutorial is going to primarily focus on designing a tree trunk and leaves, and what we want to do is we want to create a very heightened fantasy tree, basically something that looks very unreal and also real at the same time. So it's like a heightened sense of reality. And I'm just going to start out by drawing, a really quick sketch. And I'm going to do about a couple of these just to show you my quick process. And now when I'm drawing, I'm just using some very loose lines and shapes and just following and trying to figure out what would make a tree look really cool. I really like the very curvy kind of oak trees that are out there with the big knots, those big knot holes that are in the trunk, etc. So we want to try really exaggerating those shapes. So this sketch I've drawn, I've kept it very loose and I've added this very curvy shape to it. And this is kind of the approach and direction that I'm going to head in when I finally paint our final tree. And you want to kind of draw in the direction of how you think the tree will curve and flow. And notice how my lines are kind of going in that direction. And it goes along the way I feel that the tree would grow. So, if it's curving to the right, then those lines are going to kind of draw around the tree to show the direction which the tree is moving. And of course, when we finally do, a quick sketch for trees, just to get an idea of the silhouette, I'm going to color this part of the leaves in. And by doing this and by working this small, I'm able to decide and kind of realize if my tree shape works, if there's something I'd like to change. And this is usually the best way to approach this process, starting out with a smaller tree, a loose sketch, and playing with shapes. Now I've taken the eraser tool. You can just hit E on your keyboard to do this. And I'm just going to kind of cut out along the outside very loosely. I think, I really like that rough, edgy, kind of sharp edge that some drawings have to them. So that's what I'm going to take in this case. I don't really like the very roundness that I drew, so I want to sharpen up a few edges, straight lines against curved lines, essentially. Let's try another silhouette. On a new layer, making sure that my dual brush in this case is selected, I'm going to try another shape. Let's very loosely draw out the trunk, kind of going from a very diagonal angle. And I'm going to have a trunk kind of curve up to the top and then give it a very thick base below. When it comes to doing these kind of tree drawings, you can try this kind of technique with any tree that you prefer. I personally, get inspired by oak trees or elm trees, and I really like those big, round, bulky shapes that their tree trunks have. And I really love exaggerating those branches and just accentuating that. So, think about the trees that you're getting your inspiration from and really exaggerate those shapes when you're doing it. I like to keep my lines very rough, very loose, you know, just before I actually lay down a stroke, I really think about it for a split second and then lay it down. And I want to keep it as loose as possible. I don't want to keep very thin and small lines when I'm drawing. I want to think big and think of it, you know, as a bigger picture, as the entire tree as a whole, not just, you know, the bark or just the leaves. And now I've zoomed out. I want to start looking at this, you know, as though it were a smaller thumbnail. And the reason for this is it's easier to gauge the shape and silhouette of something when you're looking at it from a very small point of view. By the way, I hit Z on my keyboard and I use the Alt and or Option key to zoom in and out. And I'm really just, you know, focusing on the shape for now. And by zooming out, I pay less attention to the detail and more on how the tree looks and feels and whether it has the right shape language. And now I just want to add a little bit of, you know, a loose idea of where the shadow of the tree will be. And, you know, just adding a few light details here and there. Not too much, but yeah, this is essentially, you know, how I would kind of thumbnail out my tree and just the simple process that you can try for doing it. I would call this the thumbnailing stage. And, you know, I'm going to add that little cool little knot I mentioned that trees have, that really curvy kind of round twirl that you see. I'm going to accentuate that, and I'm going to add that, you know, in all my tree concepts as I'm doing them. And now I want to try another thumbnail. I want to really exaggerate those curves, and maybe let's try giving our trunk a very thin, you know, figure and silhouette this time. And notice how I'm really like layering those curves on and, you know, having one curve kind of fall and tie into another. This kind of shows us almost a 3D perspective of how the tree is curving. You know, it doesn't really have that flat, completely stagnant shape to it. By adding these round curves, I'm drawing, you know, as I mentioned before, along the shape of what the trunk would look like. So it kind of flows in a particular way. I want to add another one of those little swirlies right here on the branch. And, you know, let's select a flat angled brush, and I'm going to just shade in this part dark just to show how this part would be in shadow and the bottom of this trunk would also be in shadow, kind of hinting how the top part curves around and comes forward as the tree rotates. You know, this silhouette also gives my tree a very creepy kind of eerie feel to it. Like maybe it would be something, or it would be a kind of tree that I would see in a haunted wood fantasy story or something like that. Now, if I want to add branches to my tree, I'm just going to draw a simple black silhouette shape. You know, I don't want to focus on adding in too many of the same lines that I did in the tree trunk because these branches are so small and thin. But what I will do is, because it is such a thin but fully shaded shape, and it is on a neutral gray background, what I can do is, in this case, just to start adding in some dimension and depth to my branches, if I were to start painting, is to select a lighter gray midtone similar to our background and start shading in that part of the branch, and just instantly I've given my branch a perspective. I've given it depth, just that little touch of lighting, and I'm just adding another little highlight on the top, and it just stands out instantly. And it was just a very simple step. You know, I just shaded in the branch, added in a little bit of gray, and added the highlight. Now in our next video, we're going to start out with illustrating the actual tree, and we're going to use the same process as I showed you in this video. We're going to just start out with that light sketch, and then we're going to, start with an underpainting and then take it from there.